I think the most important thing that the American population does not understand about the prison is that it has not always looked the same, especially in the American South. And so the penitentiary really didn't exist in the South until after Reconstruction failed. And when the Jim Crow laws were passed, all of the southern states, with the exception of Tennessee, passed loitering statutes. And if you were not in a labor contract with a sharecropper, you could get 30 days to life imprisonment. And so these southern states were then refilled with the same racists who wanted to secede and to preserve, segregation and slavery, and they built huge prisons to warehouse all of these former slaves. They put them on former plantations, and they were forced to do labor there. So in Arkansas, Cummins Prison is probably the most famous, and the prisoners there, it was a working farm, so they were basically slaves for the state. They had to turn a profit. They were not paid for their labor. They produced tons of goods and services for the states that had penitentiary labor, and that became part of the architecture of the economy of states after Jim Crow, was seemingly over. So, between, let's say, the 1920s, after World War I, all the way to the early 1960s then, you see the growth of those penitentiaries as ways of funneling black labor into this informal state economy that's buttressing state power. So when, black Americans start organizing into what we now call the modern civil rights movement, which starts, after Brown v. Board in '54, then you see, all of these new opportunities for municipalities and states to have to manage black bodies that are refusing to conform to what the state wants them to do, either as producers or as consumers, and so they start getting funneled into the prisons. But what I found is that these civil rights activists and later black power activists went into the prisons, but they learned a whole lot about the functioning of power, state power, local power, police power, in going into local jails and prisons, and then they brought that back out, and it helped them really transform political organizing and the relationships that they made as they built coalition. So it had an effect where going into the prisons intentionally to fill the prisons as a way of resisting the state also then fed mass incarceration. But in the South, in the early part of the civil rights movement, all of these preachers and housewives and local business people and school teachers and janitors, they went into the prisons to save their kids' futures. And so they saw how the prison functions in relationship to state legislatures and governors. And they came out with a higher degree of political commitment to the movement. And that really shaped the way that black Americans in civil rights spaces related to, both the movement and politics in ways that were totally profound and still have, an influence on social movement organizing. And I was interested in prisons because they've exploded so much since the Johnson administration. Now we call it mass incarceration, but really the moment where the American psyche turned towards the prison as a way of managing its anxieties about new rights that were being given to women and people of color and students, and those anxieties really found a place in the American prison system, which grew as a result of activism. So the birth of what we now call massive incarceration really started during the Johnson administration as a way to manage anxiety about all of these groups who are protesting a lack of rights in the United States. And so I was curious about that relationship. So what were those activists writing about from prison, and how did prison shape them? And what did it teach them? And what did it teach us? And what does it continue to teach us? And then as a result, how did the presidents respond, and how did municipalities respond to the fact that their local jails and then penitentiaries were being filled with activists? And it changed a lot of dynamics between the federal government and state governments and municipalities, and thinking about, how quickly, or in reality, how slowly, to grant more citizenship rights to groups that had been historically disenfranchised. And so here you have mass incarceration of all of these black activists that are going into prison for activism as political prisoners, and then they're sharing time with people who have mostly, in the 1960s, were there for property crimes. And so, the Black Power consciousness was one that really tried to resituate blackness in the legacy of Jim Crow and in the Southern Penitentiary and in, the failure of Reconstruction and in contemporary black life and its similarities to slavery. And that seemed very important to me. The origin of the Black Power slogan begins in 1966. It's uttered by Stokely Carmichael, And Carmichael and Martin Luther King had marched together, and Stokely had gone into Parchman Prison. It's a penitentiary in Mississippi. It was probably the most brutal penitentiary in the United States at that time. And he had been beaten and whipped, and they put wrist breakers on the prisoners, men and women there, and they clasp on the wrist, and then you tighten the screw, and it's meant to break the wrists. He was tortured there. And coming out of that experience in Mississippi during and after the Mississippi Freedom Summer in 64, 65, Stokely wanted a more radical positionality for these sharecropping families. Like, they needed political rights and they needed resources, and they needed them now. They couldn't afford to wait for King to build this Christian goodwill and to teach everybody nonviolence. And so as Stokely and King continue to march together, Stokely is constantly pushing King to talk about blackness instead of Negro. And he says, you know, Negro is a term that white people have given us, right? It's close to the N-word. We disavow it. The problem is not that we're Negroes. The problem is that the color of our skin is black. And so by the end of 1965, Stokely has King talking about blacks as of folks. And that linguistic shift that King makes from Negro to black is very significant, because King then starts defending black power as Stokely starts organizing in the cities, and as new organizations across the country emerge, like the Black Panther Party. And King says, you know, these kids would not be saying these radical things and doing these radical actions if you would give them the formal political rights that they're totally entitled to by virtue of their citizenship. And so for me, I think it's really King's connection with black power that helps radicalize him over the course of his life and create space for him to take up a different kind of relationship to his own Christianity, to his Southern identity, to his role in the world as a Nobel Prize winner. It allows him to take up space as an anti-war activist. It allows him to talk about class in a way that was not possible when he was a younger man coming out of the church, his father's church. I mean, it really black power creates space for King to become more radical. And it also gets him killed then, because as he's more radical and he's taking up all of this space for the sanitation workers in Memphis and doing the Poor People's Campaign, it makes him more dangerous because his ideas are more revolutionary. They take bigger risks. And so that was unacceptable. And so the fate that befalls Malcolm in 65 befalls Martin in 68. And then, you know, as the counterintelligence programs of the FBI spread, most of the major leaders of the Black Power movement are either assassinated by the state or they are exiled. And so by the end of the 1970s, Black Power is pretty much over. Everybody who had been affiliated in any meaningful way as a leader was either dead, in prison, or in exile. And so those prison spaces then become very salient, because everybody who had any affiliation with the movement and who had institutional knowledge of the organizations that built Black Power civil rights, they were imprisoned by, you know, frame-ups mostly. So I am particularly interested in two parts of prison activism. One is what kinds of documentation were produced inside of the prisons and reflexive of prison experience by activists. So those are things like King's letter from Birmingham jail, and those are memoirs written in prison or written after prison that are circulated about that experience. And then I'm also interested in the way that activists talk about that experience as ways of intervening into public consciousness. And Malcolm X's autobiography, I mean, it is a massive bestseller. It's on every bestseller list. It's every college campus. It goes out of print and then is reprinted dozens of times. And it's sort of the gold standard in terms of memoir. But after his assassination in 1965, dozens of activists then use that template, right, to write about their experiences in prison and to think about the relationship between being black and being imprisoned. And so I'm interested in those because they tell us about black consciousness, and they tell us about criminalization of poverty, and they tell us about Black networks, and they tell us about how Black Americans viewed the political system and how they operated within informal political structures. I mean, they tell us all kinds of interesting, important things about how Black people have survived under a surveillance police state for so long. And then I'm interested in how they talk about their relationships within the movement, and so how they talk about resistance, you know, having families as an act of resistance, how they think about closeness with other activists, how they think about collective and shared trauma. And so those are spaces where they invented new ideas and new vernaculars and new words to help describe their relationship to the police state and to police brutality and to the prison. And that's all new idea. Those are new ideas that have value, that had a ton of value in organizing a tremendous number of Black folks to mobilize. One of the things that I think is most interesting about imprisonment as a source of political and rhetorical intervention is that the men and women who write from prison or about prison have seen the inside of a massive U.S. institution that the rest of us don't have access to, and they have the stories of other people who've basically been disappeared. And the Black Power movement used prison activists inside and outside to talk about the relationship between Black America and the state, saying, you know, Black America is an internal colony, right? That we are in a revolutionary situation where we are being continually dominated. Slavery never ended. You know, the 13th Amendment just wrote it into the Constitution formally and made prison the site of new slavery, and this is what that looks like. But it also helped actually change different states' statutes about imprisonment. So in California, which of course has the largest penal population in the United States, it's the prisoners' rights movement that comes out of Black Power that ends the civil death statute, right? That says that that disenfranchised the imprisoned and wouldn't let them vote, wouldn't let them go to school, right? It ends that statute and creates opportunities for them to organize within prison. And then you have prisoners' unions that spread across the country inside prisons, where the prisoners begin to make demands and organize and riot for better working conditions, better food, better health care, you know, and how else would they have done that if they weren't, you know, talking about structures of agitation that helped deliver basic human rights to them?